If Twitter and TikTok are going to do one thing, it's beat a dead horse. And at this point, the horse is looking like a thestral. Hey y'all, it's Henny, and today we are going to be talking about whether or not Beyonce stole Amerie's sound. Actually, I'm just kidding. We're going to be talking about what the sound actually is and who the producer is that brought it back into the mainstream. So this whole argument between the Hive and either fans of Amerie or just people who hate Beyonce, yes, they exist. Yes, they're really weird. But this whole argument has been going for like over a decade now, kind of closing in on 20 years. So there has been this ongoing discussion since the release of One Thing by Amerie, in that it apparently sounds a lot like Crazy in Love by Beyonce. And if people would just stop for like literally a minute to do any sort of research on ye old Guggenheim, they would realize that these songs are by the same exact producer. And that producer was a man by the name of Rich Harrison, who was a big staple in the early 2000s R&B scene. And the reason why he was such a big staple was because he literally helped revive the go-go sound that is native to Washington, D.C. So go-go music can actually be looked at as a subgenre of funk that kind of infuses Latin conga rhythms and has more of a focus on the percussion. This was a sound that was kind of pioneered by Experience Unlimited, the Junkyard Band, Chuck Brown and the Soul Searchers. But for the most part, go-go remained isolated in Washington, D.C. and kind of just became a staple in the nightlife. Over the years, it's kind of taken on influence from hip-hop and breakbeat, which is basically what gives you that sampled drum loop that makes things very lively and danceable. You can hear it in literally all of the records that people are comparing between Beyonce and Amerie, J-Lo. So Rich Harrison actually got his big break in the 90s when he went on to work on Mary J. Blige's 4th and 5th studio albums. So he produced Beautiful Ones and then kind of vamped up his more go-go retro influence with In the Meantime that he produced for No More Drama. It was in 2001 where Rich Harrison established his own production company and then went on to immediately write and produce Amerie's debut album. And that's where we got a lot of him kind of hammering out that go-go sound. And this isn't me trying to speak in absolutes, but I don't think go-go had much of a global spotlight until Rich Harrison revived the sound for Amerie, Kelly Rowland, Beyonce, J-Lo. It was those hits in the early 2000s that kind of made people wake up and realize that go-go is a pretty rich genre to explore. I think one of my favorite things about how Rich Harrison went about reviving go-go music was essentially sampling really great records from the past and kind of expanding on their legacy by producing something that was just as great. Rich Harrison basically got connected to Amerie through a McDonald's parking lot audition. They met up, she auditioned in his car, and then from there, he heard her voice and was just like, all right, we're gonna cut some demos together. And then that's when they hammered out the sound for her debut album, All I Have. As far as the comparisons between all these women and who stole what, I feel like it's just like, at the end of the day, you have to acknowledge that it's sexism. Because once you listen to enough go-go music, especially with what Rich Harrison did on his productions, you realize that he's borrowing elements from his previous productions and putting them and kind of remixing them into something new. You'll hear vocalizations and even lyrics on an Amerie project that he kind of recycled into a Beyonce project that got recycled into a J-Lo project that got recycled into a Tony project. Like, it's just part of his evolution as a producer and not necessarily these women stealing from each other. But I think the interview that Amerie had on The Breakfast Club with Leonard and that terrible gang.
To the point where you thought Beyonce was trying to imitate you?
No, I wouldn't say that. I mean, a lot of people are going to say different things, but it's like what I was saying. Like, artists, we're all in dialogue with each other. So no artist is an island. You can't say, oh, well, I have no influences. And sometimes people try to say, well, I have an influence, like the 50-year-old ones from back in the day. But it's like we're all influenced by old music and current music. Like, you can't get around it.
But y'all was on the same label.
Yeah, but that never
Similar
really.
sound.
Then she started
we were
working
on
with
the-
Rich.
We were on the same label, but that I don't think that did anything.
She described that dynamic as artists being in dialogue with each other. And I think that's very apparent when you listen to, One Thing by Amerie and hear the vocalizations that Beyonce did on Greenlight. But I want people to move beyond seeing like all of these shared elements as one artist stealing from another, and more just artists in general kind of creating a benchmark for these sounds. Especially when it's hinging on a shared producer. Like, he's writing this music with that artist. He's creating the music with that artist. I think over the course of that discography, we're going to notice Rich Harrison's thumbprint. It's important to note that Beyonce, Amerie, and Rich Harrison were born within 3 years of each other. Rich Harrison was born in 79, Amerie was born in 1980, Beyonce was born in 1981. They probably all grew up hearing funk and go-go music, and that probably explains why they're naturally drawn to the sound, especially with Rich Harrison being a DC native, and of course, Amerie meeting Rich Harrison in Washington, D.C. when she was studying. And I think the reason why that exists on Greenlight is because of the very nature of Beyonce's process for making B-Day. She had Rich Harrison, the Neptunes, and a few other people in a bunch of rooms and kind of fostering friendly competition between producers to make her album. So of course you're going to hear the Neptunes try and recreate or put their spin on a sound that Rich Harrison was currently reviving at the time. Right, like Greenlight was produced by the Neptunes and Sean Garrett, but critics at the time when they heard it said that it was almost a direct echo to Crazy in Love. I think that was fully intentional. I think their intention was to kind of evolve the sound that Beyonce debuted on. And of course, I don't think that's Beyonce just full on copying Amerie. I just think it's like the nature of being an artist. It's like if you're inspired by someone's sound, I think you're going to throw out that obvious like calling card. Okay, so there's also a point that I want to make about how people are only taking notice of when the sound was actually successful, but the actuality is that Rich Harrison was kind of shopping this sound around to a lot of the people that he was working with. So it wasn't just Amerie, it wasn't just Beyonce, and it wasn't just J-Lo. They were just the most successful with the go-go sound. He also shopped it around to Toni Braxton for her Libra album, Take This Ring. Her voice didn't quite suit the production in my opinion. To me, go-go music needs a more like electric voice, and Toni Braxton is more sultry, smoky. And he also did a song with Christina Aguilera called Makes Me Wanna Pray. Makes Me Wanna Pray is an album cut from Christina Aguilera's Back to Basics, and while I do believe that she gave a pretty stellar vocal performance on here, it's a shame that the track didn't get a single treatment, especially when Rich Harrison employed a pretty ingenious sample of Glad by Traffic. Rich Harrison himself has said that go-go music, well, especially what he was trying to do with it, wasn't for everyone. Even the instrumental for Crazy in Love was not really felt by anyone but Harrison himself, and it even took Beyonce a while to warm up to it because she was convinced that horn samples in the 21st century were kind of like a faux pas. A lot of people thought it was a pretty weird sound, and a lot of voices just kind of clash with the production. So it does require a voice with almost a certain electricity to it, and that's something that I believe Amerie's like bright soprano tone and Beyonce's like really amazing clean belts can really do justice. Yeah, the conversation about who stole what from whom has always felt very sexist because it's always a focus on the women, right? And especially like Beyonce being a supposed thief of this sound that was revived by Rich Harrison, but they never take into a fact that he was also working with men in the industry as well. Like he worked on Usher's Confessions, he produced Take Your Hand, and also Get Right was going to be on Confessions before it got given to J-Lo. But yeah, Rich Harrison was working with Usher, Diddy, Mos Def, and as well as like inspiring and working with other producers who were men. I think the reason why people attribute this sound to Beyonce is because literally out of all the people listed, she was the strongest performer. But it's very curious just because like all of these artists at the time were putting out bodies of work that had a significantly 70s, 80s sort of sonic palette, whether it was through samples, the songwriting, or through the vocals. Granted, I think that sort of just became a career staple for Beyonce. I think every project that she put out kind of had something retro leaning on it if the entire body of work wasn't already retro leaning. But I still like to think that the work that Rich Harrison did with Beyonce on Crazy in Love sowed the seeds for what would become a B-Day eventually, and then all these years later would become the monumental cultural moment that was Homecoming. And that's kind of the conclusion of my thoughts. I think Rich Harrison created one of the more like lively, fun, interesting soundscapes of the early 2000s. And I'm actually curious to see if Go-Go will ever see like another mainstream revival, or if it will just continue to be like the gem of Washington, D.C. But as always, thank you for listening to me drone on and on about music. Thank you for the support. Give this a like, a comment, share it with your friend. And if you have any other suggestions for things that you want me to talk about, please let me know in the comments. Seriously. All right.